Welcome everyone to a very special story, a journey full of drama and depth from the Bible, the extraordinary epic of Jacob. This is not just a story about a man who wrestled with himself and with God, but also a testimony of struggles, deceit, and the search for faith in life. From the moment he was born, Jacob faced fierce competition, but no one could have imagined that, in a dark and stormy night, he would enter a divine struggle, one that involved not just the body, but the soul. This is a story of spiritual transformation, about how the darkest moments of life can become an opportunity to encounter the divine. Have you ever wondered if, in our most difficult times, we can find the light? Stay with us to discover this story right after this. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next videos. Jacob is first mentioned in the Bible in the book of Genesis chapter 25, when Rebekah, Jacob's mother, was pregnant with him and his twin brother, Esau. She prayed to God because she didn't understand why the two children in her womb were struggling with each other. The Lord answered her that the rivalry between the two brothers would foretell the rise of two nations that would come from them. Jacob would become the father of Israel, and Esau would be the father of Edom, according to Genesis 36. Furthermore, Esau, the older brother, would serve Jacob, the younger brother, as stated in Genesis 25:23. Genesis 25 recounts the genealogy of Isaac, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and when Isaac was 40 years old, he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, a man from Aram and Paddan-aram, and the sister of Laban, also from Aram. Isaac prayed to the Lord because his wife was unable to have children. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The children struggled within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, she gave birth to two sons. When they were born, the first one came out red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. Afterward, his twin brother was born, with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man, staying among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. The character of Jacob in the Bible is closely associated with deceit and cunning, from his birth to his wrestling with God in Genesis 32:24-29. One of Jacob's most famous acts of deception was against his twin brother Esau in an attempt to take Esau's birthright, which entitled him to a double portion of his father Isaac's inheritance. Jacob offered his brother a bowl of stew in exchange for Esau's birthright, as stated in Genesis 25 verse 29-34. One time, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, exhausted and famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die. What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So Esau swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. Esau ate and drank, and then got up and left. Esau despised his birthright. Moreover, Jacob stole Esau's blessing, which Esau was supposed to receive from his father, as described in Genesis 27:1-29. When Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could not see, he called for Esau, his older son, and said, "My son, here I am." Esau answered, "Here I am, father." Isaac said, "I am now an old man and do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and bow, and go out into the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." At that time, Rebekah was listening as Isaac spoke to his son Esau. When Esau went out to the open country to hunt game and bring it back, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "Listen, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Bring me some game and prepare me some tasty food to eat, so that I may give you my blessing in the presence of the Lord before I die. Now, my son, listen carefully and do what I tell you. Go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats, so I can prepare some tasty food for your father, just the way he likes it. Then take it to your father to eat, so that he may give you his blessing before he dies." Jacob said to his mother, "But my brother Esau is a hairy man, while I have smooth skin. What if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him and would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing." His mother replied, "My son, let the curse fall on me. Just do what I say. Go and get them for me." So Jacob went and got the goats and brought them to his mother. She prepared some tasty food, just the way his father liked it. Then Rebekah took the best clothes of her older son Esau, which she had in the house, and put them on her younger son Jacob. She also covered his hands and the smooth part of his neck with the goatskins. Then she gave Jacob the tasty food and the bread she had made. Jacob went to his father and said, "My father, here I am." Isaac answered, "Who are you, my son?" Jacob said, "I am Esau, your firstborn son. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game, so that you may give me your blessing." Isaac asked him, "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" Jacob replied, "The Lord, your God, gave me success." Isaac said to Jacob, "Come near so I can touch you, my son, to know whether you really are my son Esau or not." Jacob went close to his father Isaac, who touched him and said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." Isaac did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau. So he proceeded to bless him. Isaac asked, "Are you really my son Esau?" Jacob replied, "I am." Isaac said, "My son, bring me some of your game to eat, so that I may give you my blessing." Jacob brought it to him, and he ate, and he brought some wine, and Isaac drank. Afterward, Isaac said to Jacob, "Come here, my son, and kiss me." So Jacob went to him and kissed him. When Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, he blessed him and said, "Ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you the dew of heaven and the richness of the earth, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed." After Jacob received this blessing, Esau the firstborn returned and wanted to kill his brother. Therefore Jacob had to flee. On his way to his mother's homeland, Jacob saw angels and a ladder reaching up to heaven. When Jacob arrived in Haran, he met his worthy rival, his uncle Laban, as recorded in Genesis 29. At this point, I want to send a prayer to those watching this video. Pray that we all be blessed by God and be able to find good jobs to support our children and families. If you are also praying for this, please comment Amen below so we can join together in unity in the Lord. Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern people near Haran. When he saw a well in the field and 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, for the flocks drank from the well, the stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the mouth of the well to water the sheep, and then they would return the stone to its place. Jacob asked them, "Where are you from?" They answered, "We are from Haran." Jacob asked them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson, Abraham's brother?" They answered, "We know him." Jacob asked, "Is he well?" They replied, "He is well. Here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." Jacob said, "Look, it is still broad daylight. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture." But they replied, "We cannot do that until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep." While Jacob was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. When Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, he went over, rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well, and watered the flock of Laban. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. Jacob told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and the son of Rebekah. Rachel ran home and told her father. When Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him, embraced him, kissed him, and brought him to his home. Then Jacob told Laban everything. Laban said to Jacob, "You are my own flesh and blood." So Jacob stayed with Laban for a month. After a month, Laban said to Jacob, "Just because you are a relative of mine, you should not work for me for nothing. Tell me what your wages should be." Laban had 2 daughters. The older daughter was named Leah, and the younger one was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob was in love with Rachel, so he said, "I will work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel as my wife." Laban replied, "It is better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob worked for Laban for 7 years to gain Rachel as his wife. But those 7 years seemed like only a few days to Jacob because of his love for her. Finally, Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife. My 7 years are completed, and I want to marry her." Laban invited all the men of the place to a feast, and they celebrated with a wedding banquet. But that evening, Laban took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob slept with her. And Laban gave his servant girl Zilpah to his daughter Leah as her maidservant. When morning came, there was Leah. Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I worked for you for 7 years to get Rachel, but why have you deceived me and treated me this way?" Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." Laban continued, "Complete the week of this wedding celebration, and then we will give you Rachel also in return for another 7 years of work." Jacob agreed and completed the week of the wedding celebration for Leah. Then Laban gave Rachel to Jacob as his wife. Laban also gave his servant girl Bilhah to Rachel as her maidservant. So Jacob slept with Rachel and married her. Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, and he continued to work for Laban for another 7 years. Jacob was deceived into marrying Leah, his sister. However, Jacob persevered and finally married the woman he loved. Jacob worked for Laban for many years, and through the protection of the Lord and his own skill, Jacob gained a large portion of Laban's livestock. Eventually, God told Jacob to return to his ancestral land. The problem was that this meant Jacob would have to face Esau. Would his brother's anger still be as fierce after all these years? Although God had promised Jacob that he would father not just one great nation, but many nations, Jacob remained fearful and anxious. Jacob was about to face his brother Esau, who had sworn to kill him at a crucial moment in his life. All of Jacob's efforts and fears were about to come to a head. Jacob had fled from Laban, but now he had to confront his angry brother. Jacob prepared a gift to appease Esau and sent a caravan of gifts across the Jabbok River along with his wives and children, hoping to calm Esau's anger. At this moment, Jacob was alone and could only rely on the Lord, just as we, when facing difficulties, should trust and rely on the Lord, and we will be saved. Do you believe that? If so, please subscribe to the channel and continue following Jacob's story in this video. Jacob had lost all his earthly possessions, his body was exhausted, and he felt lonely in the wilderness, facing death at any moment. The truth was, he could not control his fate. At the Jabbok River, Jacob fell into a deep sleep despite his father-in-law behind him and Esau in front of him. He was too weary to fight. But it was at this moment that his real battle began. Fleeing from his family was hard enough, but wrestling with God himself was a whole different matter. That night, Jacob was visited by a stranger. Genesis 32 verse 22 says, "That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak." Jacob had fought all his life. From the moment he was born, he had been in conflict with Esau. Later, he clashed with Laban. But just before meeting Esau again, Jacob went through the hardest moment of his life. The one who had once grasped his brother's heel was now wrestling with God himself. When Jacob was left alone, he had a strange encounter. A man wrestled with him until dawn. When the man saw he could not overpower Jacob, he touched the socket of his hip, and Jacob's hip was wrenched as they wrestled. Then the stranger said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" Jacob answered, "Jacob." Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob asked the man, "Please tell me your name." But the man replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose as Jacob left Peniel, and he was limping because his hip was injured. That is why, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the hip socket, because the hip socket of Jacob was touched near the tendon. Note that Jacob was 79 years old at this time, so there is no reason to believe he could physically overpower an angel, though there is no doubt that the wrestling match was real. However, we should not confuse this with the main point of the story. When the text says that Jacob's opponent could not defeat him, it does not mean that Jacob physically overcame the man. The fact that the stranger could easily harm Jacob indicates that any defeat would have been spiritual, not physical. If the wrestler could not defeat Jacob spiritually, it was because Jacob would not yield. It was only when the stranger threatened to leave without offering assurance of God's help that Jacob was willing to negotiate about the important matter. The turning point came when Jacob told the stranger that he would not let him go unless God gave him the assurance of his help. This shows Jacob's willingness to accept God's demands on his life. At this moment, Jacob's perseverance had its effect. He was willing to go all the way, alongside the blessing he received through the change of his name. This was crucial for Jacob because his name had become symbolic of his character throughout history. A change of name represented a change in character. Changing someone's name is a way of asserting power over them. Jacob accepted the change of his name, which also meant accepting the change in his character. His new name symbolized a shift in one of his inherent strengths, perseverance. It was this very perseverance that had helped Jacob succeed in his relationships with people, and now that same perseverance helped him triumph in his struggle with God. In God's way of working, sometimes we must lose before we can win. Jacob's request to know the name of the man he wrestled with might have been a final attempt to maintain control, but the stranger refused. Who was this stranger? Throughout the story, the narrator refers to him as a man, but at the end of the story, he is called Elohim, God. The stranger wounded Jacob's hip, but Jacob refused to let go until the stranger blessed him. Jacob realized that he wasn't wrestling with a man, but with God himself, and he would not let go until he was blessed. The place of this struggle is called Peniel, which means face of God in Hebrew. We can draw lessons from the wrestling match between Jacob and God. First, we need forgiveness, and only God's mercy can grant us that. Jacob was responsible for what he had done to Esau, and he was fully aware of it. Jacob had relied on his own cunning to succeed up until this point, but now he didn't know what would happen next. His survival depended on whether Esau would forgive him for the wrongs of the past. Although Jacob could not control his brother's heart, there was one who could. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Genesis 32:24. It was at this moment that Jacob realized he could no longer rely on his own strength. He could not control the forgiveness he needed to survive. Second, God values perseverance, especially in the pursuit of him. Even though the stranger injured Jacob's hip during their wrestling, Jacob did not let him go until the blessing was given. Jacob possessed two admirable qualities. One was his spiritual sensitivity, which had been demonstrated when he fled from his brother and saw the ladder reaching to heaven, and again when he obeyed God's call to return to his homeland. Jacob's perseverance was evident in his pursuit of Rachel and his patient service to Laban in order to marry her. It was this perseverance that helped him prevail in his wrestling match with the stranger, who ultimately granted him spiritual transformation. What made this struggle even more significant were the consequences Jacob had to face afterward. He did not deserve the blessing, but he was willing to accept any judgment or consequence that came with it. These consequences were not insignificant. The wrestling match left him with a permanent limp, but in the end, Jacob received the blessing. Third, our identity is found in Christ. God gave Jacob a new name, Israel. Jacob came from a rather special family. He was the descendant of those who would become many nations through his grandfather's faith. Jacob inherited a bit of his grandmother Sarah's jealousy, some of his mother's wisdom and wit, and part of his father's loyalty. He was named the supplanter from birth and lived up to that name. Jacob was selfish in his early years. Jacob was partly changed by his love for Rachel and his loyalty to her family, but it was in his struggle with God that he reached a pivotal turning point. He was baptized and became Israel, Prince of God. So, what does this new name mean? It represents a new person. Throughout the Bible, God does this many times. Every new believer receives this transformation from Jesus Christ. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. 2 Corinthians 5:17. God reminds Jacob of his new name again in Genesis 35:10. God said to him, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel." So he named him Israel. This is something that often happens to us. God calls us beloved, a new creation in him, but sometimes we forget who we are. We must hold on to our new identity after we've wrestled with God. We may make mistakes and get lost in our self-identity, but we can always return to what God has called us to become. Jacob knew that God was the God of his father and grandfather. However, the God with whom Jacob wrestled at the Jabbok River was God in the form of a man. God became the God of Jacob's heart throughout the struggle. Understanding what God has done for others is not the same as understanding what he has done for ourselves. God cares more about the condition of our hearts than whether we live a successful, righteous life. Closeness to God requires humility. The sun rose as Jacob passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Genesis 32:31. This physical weakness was a sign of the new humility in Jacob's heart. For Jacob, who was confident and quick-witted, this was an important lesson. Merriam-Webster defines humility as freedom from pride or arrogance. In today's world, humility seems to go against culture and success, but in God's world, we become better people when we let go of pride and trust in him. God humbled many characters in the Bible, including Jacob. Similar stories can be found in the transformation of Simon Peter and Saul into Paul. In fact, Paul later wrote about his thorn in the flesh so that he would not become conceited from the great revelations he received. "There was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.' Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." 2 Corinthians 12:7-10. No one wants to live a life with disabilities or illness to maintain humility, but God knows what we need, and that dependence on him, not on ourselves, is our greatest strength. The sun rose on Jacob as he limped away. He had a new physical ailment, but he also had a new identity, a new name, and a new intimate relationship with God. God is not reluctant to bless us, even though it may initially seem that way. In fact, he has more blessings for us in our struggles than when we don't face challenges. Remember, God came to Jacob to make him wrestle. God is the one who initiated the battle. When God appeared, Jacob was consumed with fear about Esau and the army approaching to kill him. The struggle pulled Jacob away from his state of fear and forced him to focus on God. I doubt Jacob initially wanted or even thought he needed this focus, probably praying, "Lord, please take this away. This is the last thing I need right now." But what Jacob discovered was that the struggle was the conduit for God's blessings to pour down on him. There are countless benefits to struggle. You may not need gentle comforts, private time for reflection, sleep, or even a healthy hip. What you need is God's favor. When God invites you to wrestle with Him in prayer, it's an invitation to receive His blessings. Be persistent with Him, and don't give up. Don't let Him go until He blesses you. God delights in persistent faith, and through it, you will be transformed. Today, like Jacob, we can enter into a relationship with Christ by confessing our sins and declaring Him as our Savior and Redeemer. God can give us new life as His children when we acknowledge our brokenness before Him, and we can enter into an eternal relationship with Him, full of blessings and promises for our lives. Through the new name Israel, Jacob was able to experience a new identity. Similarly, when we meet Christ, we undergo a transformation. Everything changes: our lives, our thoughts, our actions, and more. We can also learn from Jacob's story that those in the Bible who struggled with God did so not only physically. There's nothing wrong with having questions and wanting to understand more about the Bible. Christian faith is not blind. It is based on what God has revealed to us in the past. We can wrestle with Him and still come out of that struggle with a new identity and blessings through the refining process. Remember what God did when He wrestled with Jacob. Jacob spent the whole night in fear and anticipation of Esau's coming. He was terrified and desperate, but he came out of that night with God's blessing and renewed faith. All struggles of faith with God lead to peace when we need God's comfort. Sometimes, God sends His comfort in unexpected, even unwanted packages. If necessary, God will cause us to limp to strengthen our faith. God even allowed Jacob to be injured, making him more vulnerable before Esau, which forced Jacob to place his trust in God rather than in himself. If necessary, God will cause us to limp to strengthen our faith. Ultimately, Jacob's identity changed through his struggle with God. He was no longer remembered as the one who stole a blessing through deceit, but this time, he received God's blessing because he had prevailed with God through faith. This struggle proved to be a gracious gift from God's restoration, similar to the gift Jesus gave to Peter when He allowed him to affirm His love for him as many times as he had denied Him. After they had breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." He asked him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Tend my sheep." A third time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he asked him 3 times, and he said, "Lord, you know everything, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep," John 20:15-17. God was pleased with Jacob's persistent faith and gave him what he asked for, Hebrews 11:6. When God calls us to wrestle with Him, there is always more happening than we see, and God always uses that struggle to fulfill His good plans. God transforms us to be better. We glorify wealth, power, strength, confidence, prestige, and victory in modern society, while despising and fearing weakness, failure, and doubt. While we acknowledge that vulnerability, fear, and discouragement are normal parts of life, we often see them as signs of failure or even a lack of faith. We also know that naive optimism and flashy praises of success only lead to dissatisfaction and despair. In real life, most of us will have to face the harsh realities of life, sooner or later. Jacob's story brings us back to this reality. One of the most famous Christian authors, Frederick Buechner, describes Jacob's sacred encounter at the Jabbok River as the glorious defeat of the human soul at the hands of God. We can easily recognize our own struggles in Jacob's story: fear, darkness, loneliness, vulnerability, emptiness, helplessness, exhaustion, and the constant pain. Even the Apostle Paul felt discouraged and afraid. We are hard-pressed on every side. Outside were conflicts, inside were fears. 2 Corinthians 7 verse 5. But in reality, God does not want to abandon us in the trials, fears, and struggles of life. In the conflicts of life, we learn that God gives us the corresponding spiritual gift. We can only receive the strength of transformation and change through Him, along with gifts that are not just surrender, but also freedom, endurance, faith, and courage. In the end, Jacob did what all of us must do: face our failures, weaknesses, sins, and all that hurts us, and face God. Jacob wrestled with God all night long, and only after he reconciled with God and stopped fighting, realizing that he could not go on without him, did he receive God's blessing. This pivotal event in Jacob's life teaches us that our lives were never designed to be easy, especially when we decide to struggle with God and His will for our lives on our own. We also learn that, as Christians, despite the challenges and hardships, our efforts in this life will never lack God's presence, and His blessings always follow. The challenges, no matter how difficult, are not signs of abandonment, but opportunities for us to experience spiritual transformation and change in a deep relationship with God. The struggle, though sometimes messy and chaotic, is an essential part of true growth experiences. The story of Jacob wrestling with God at the Jabbok River in the dark of night is a testament to this truth. Although we may resist God and His will for us, God is incredibly good. As Christians, we may struggle with Him through lonely nights, but His blessing will come at dawn. Genesis 33, 1-12 describes Jacob's encounter with Esau after many years of separation. Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming with 400 men. At this point, Jacob divided his children, the maidservants and their children in front, then Leah and her children, and finally Rachel and Joseph at the rear. Jacob himself went ahead, and as he approached, he bowed to the ground 7 times to greet his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob, embraced him, kissed him, and they both wept. Then Esau looked up and saw the women and children and asked, "Who are these with you?" Jacob replied, "These are the children whom God has graciously given your servant." The maidservants and their children approached and bowed down before Esau. Next, Leah and her children also came forward and bowed down, and finally Joseph and Rachel came and bowed down as well. Esau asked, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob replied, "No, please. If I have found favor in your sight, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, and you have received me favorably. Please accept the gift that I brought to you, for God has dealt graciously with me, and I have enough." Thus he urged him, and Esau accepted it. Jacob continued, "For God has granted me favor, and I have all that I need." And when Jacob insisted, Esau accepted the gift. Then Esau said, "Let us be on our way. I will accompany you." But Jacob said, "My Lord knows that the children are tender, and I must care for the young ones with the flocks and herds that are nursing. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Please let my Lord go on ahead of his servant, and I will move along slowly, at the pace of the livestock before me and the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." Then Esau said, "Let me leave some of my men with you." But Jacob replied, "Why do that? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, while Jacob traveled on to Succoth, where he built a house for himself and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth, which means shelters. When Jacob came from Padan Aram, he arrived at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped near the city. Then he bought the piece of land where he had pitched his tent from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. Jacob met his brother Esau again after the struggle. Instead of killing him, Esau welcomed Jacob with a hug and joyful tears. Esau reconciled with his brother, and Jacob was saved from death. Esau didn't want to accept the gifts Jacob offered, but eventually did so at Jacob's insistence. Esau just wanted peace with his brother. However, the rest of Jacob's life was not a happily ever after ending. He would lose his beloved wife Rachel when she died while giving birth, and his favorite son would be sold into slavery by his brothers. In the end, Jacob would die in a foreign land. Yet, throughout his life, God continually reminded Jacob that he was always with him, and his promises were true, even though Jacob could not yet see how those promises would be fulfilled. We have explored a very special part of Jacob's life, a struggle not only with people, but also with himself and his faith. Through this story, we can clearly see that no challenge is without meaning, and sometimes hardships are precisely the opportunities for us to grow and draw closer to God. Do you recognize anything in your own life through this story? Are there parts of yourself where you feel the need to forgive or find peace in your heart? Are you persevering in seeking a true relationship with God? These questions are not only for reflection, but to help us find ways to move forward in faith. If you found this content valuable, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss upcoming videos. Together, we can enlighten our minds and expand our understanding of God's Word. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and may God bless you, strengthening you to remain strong and